The richest rooms in America are often the loneliest, and sometimes the only man brave enough to walk into one is the man everyone else overlooks. The crystal chandeliers above the Whitmore Grand Ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble, while a string quartet played softly beneath the conversations of senators, investors, celebrities, and billionaires who had crossed half the country to celebrate Richard Whitmore's 70th birthday. Every camera in the room waited for one announcement. Rumors had traveled for weeks that the aging billionaire was finally preparing his daughter to inherit the Whitmore empire, but only after she chose a husband worthy of standing beside her. Three successful entrepreneurs stood near the stage in tailored tuxedos, each carrying the confidence of men who believed tonight would change their future. Richard Whitmore stepped to the microphone with the ease of someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms. "I've spent my life building something meant to last," he said. "Tonight, my daughter will choose the man who will help protect that legacy." Applause echoed through the ballroom. Reporters raised their cameras. Investors exchanged knowing smiles. Everyone expected Evelyn Whitmore to walk toward one of the three men waiting beneath the spotlight. Instead, she remained perfectly still. Her expression revealed nothing. Then she quietly stepped away from the stage. At first, no one noticed she wasn't walking toward the chosen candidates. She moved past the front tables, past governors, actors, philanthropists, and executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Conversations slowly faded as guests realized she was heading toward the back of the ballroom instead. Near a service entrance, hidden from nearly every camera, a maintenance worker knelt beside an antique wooden door whose brass hinge had begun sticking before the ceremony. His black work shirt carried a simple stitched name above the pocket. Nathan. A small toolbox rested beside him. A little girl no older than 8 sat nearby with a coloring book balanced across her knees, her sneakers barely touching the polished floor. Every few minutes, she looked up at her father with complete confidence before returning to her drawing. Nathan Brooks tightened one final screw, gently tested the hinge, and smiled when the old door swung open without a sound. "There we go," he whispered. "Just like new. I knew you'd fix it, Daddy," Sophie answered with the certainty only a child could possess. Before Nathan could reply, Polished Heels stopped a few feet away. He looked up. Standing before him was Evelyn Whitmore herself. The ballroom had become so quiet that even the quartet slowly lowered their instruments. Hundreds of eyes followed her. Richard frowned from the stage, uncertain where his daughter thought she was going. Evelyn met Nathan's eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan recognized her immediately as the elegant woman whose luxury SUV he had helped during a violent rainstorm 3 weeks earlier, the woman who had never told him her last name. He had assumed she was simply another traveler stranded on a lonely roadside. She recognized him just as clearly. Then, without hesitation, Evelyn turned toward the entire ballroom. "Father," she said, her voice calm enough to carry through the silence. "You asked me to choose a husband." Richard nodded slowly, confused. Evelyn lifted one hand toward Nathan Brooks. "I choose him." Gasps rolled across the room like a wave. One champagne glass slipped from someone's fingers and landed harmlessly on thick carpet. Reporters forgot to take pictures. One of the waiting businessmen actually laughed before realizing nobody else was laughing with him. Nathan remained exactly where he was, one hand still resting on the old toolbox. Sophie looked from Evelyn to her father without understanding why everyone suddenly seemed unable to breathe. Richard stared at his daughter as though she had spoken another language. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "this isn't amusing." She never looked away from Nathan. "I'm not joking." Nathan slowly stood, brushing a trace of dust from his hands. His face remained calm, almost unreadable. He glanced toward Sophie, making sure she stayed close, then looked back at Evelyn. His eyes drifted for just a second to the delicate silver necklace resting against her collarbone. The color quietly disappeared from his face. Hanging from the chain was a tiny music box charm shaped like a bird. His late wife had once owned an identical necklace. Danielle had treasured it until the week she died. Nathan's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. He studied the charm as though trying to convince himself his memory had betrayed him. Finally, he spoke in the same steady voice he used every day with his daughter. "Where did you get that necklace?" Evelyn instinctively touched the pendant, but offered no answer. Richard descended from the stage, every step heavier than the last. "Young man," he said firmly, "whatever misunderstanding has happened here, my daughter has made an emotional decision. I'll make sure you're compensated for your time." Nathan looked from Richard to Evelyn before quietly shaking his head. "Sir," he replied, "I'm not interested in compensation." Richard reached into his jacket anyway. Nathan interrupted him before he could continue. "And you should probably find someone else." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Why?" Nathan looked briefly toward Sophie, then back at the woman standing before him. "Because you're looking for a husband," he said softly. "And I'm just a father trying to get home before my little girl falls asleep." 3 weeks earlier, the sky over downtown Ashford had turned almost black before noon. Weather alerts flashed across every billboard, and people hurried through the streets carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and grocery bags as heavy rains swept across the city. Nathan Brooks tightened the hood of his faded jacket before lifting a stack of lumber into the back of his aging pickup truck. He checked his watch. Sophie would finish her after-school art program in less than 45 minutes, and no storm was going to make him late. Keeping promises had become the quiet center of his life after Danielle passed away. Every promise mattered because Sophie remembered every one. As Nathan pulled away from the community center parking lot, traffic slowed to a crawl. Red brake lights stretched for nearly half a mile ahead. Drivers leaned impatiently on their horns while rain hammered against windshields hard enough to blur the world beyond a few feet. Off to the shoulder, a luxury sport utility vehicle sat, with its hazard lights blinking. Most drivers steered around it without another glance. Nathan almost did the same. Then he noticed someone standing beside the vehicle, holding an umbrella that had already turned inside out from the wind. He pulled onto the shoulder, stepped into ankle-deep water, and walked toward the stranded driver. The woman looked frustrated but determined not to show it. Her expensive business suit was soaked despite her efforts to stay dry. Nathan recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone who had spent her whole life believing every problem could be solved quickly until one finally could not. "Car trouble?" he asked. She nodded. "The engine stopped. Roadside assistance says it will take at least 2 hours." Nathan glanced toward the dashboard, then asked politely, "Would you mind if I take a look?" She hesitated for only a second before handing him the keys. "I should tell you I already called the dealership." Nathan smiled gently. "That usually means they will replace something expensive. Sometimes it is just a loose connection." Within 5 minutes, he discovered that heavy rain had worked its way into a damaged battery terminal. He cleaned the contact using a small brush from his toolbox, tightened the connection, and asked her to try the ignition again. The engine started immediately. Relief washed across her face. "How much do I owe you?" she asked as she reached for her purse. Nathan laughed quietly. "Nothing." She looked genuinely confused. "Nothing. You were trying to get home." "So am I." She insisted again, offering several $100 bills. Nathan shook his head. "Buy your family dinner instead." For the first time that afternoon, the woman smiled naturally instead of politely. "What if I do not have anyone waiting for dinner?" Nathan thought about Sophie, who would probably ask whether he remembered the chocolate milk she liked after art class. "Then buy yourself dinner," he answered. "Everyone deserves one good meal after a day like this." Before she could ask another question, a small voice called from inside Nathan's truck. "Daddy, are we going to be late?" Sophie pressed her hand against the passenger window with a grin that immediately softened the stranger's expression. Nathan opened the truck door. "Not if somebody remembers she promised to help me make grilled cheese tonight." Sophie giggled. "I always keep my promises." The woman watched them with quiet curiosity. She had attended charity dinners worth millions of dollars, traveled in private jets, and shaken hands with world leaders. Yet something about the easy conversation between father and daughter felt strangely unfamiliar. There was no performance, no audience, no expectation, just a father whose entire schedule revolved around making one little girl feel safe. "What is your name?" she asked before Nathan climbed back into his truck. "Nathan Brooks." "I am Evelyn." She stopped there, intentionally leaving out her last name. Nathan simply nodded. "Drive carefully, Evelyn." He never asked what she did for a living. He never recognized the luxury logo on her vehicle. He never searched her face trying to decide whether she was important enough to impress. To him, she was simply another person caught in a storm. As Nathan drove away, Sophie looked through the rear window and waved enthusiastically. Evelyn raised her hand in return, watching the old pickup disappear into sheets of rain. She remained there for several seconds after the taillights vanished. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her without wanting an investment, a favor, or an introduction. Nathan had expected nothing except the chance to help someone get home safely. She whispered his name once to herself, committing it to memory, unaware that before long, it would become the one name capable of changing the course of both their lives. Nathan Brooks believed that the strongest promises were rarely spoken in front of crowds. They were made in quiet kitchens before sunrise, in school parking lots during rainy afternoons, and in the ordinary moments when a child looked at her father expecting him to keep his word. Every morning began the same way. Coffee brewed while pancake batter rested in Danielle's old mixing bowl, and by 6 o'clock Sophie wandered into the kitchen carrying her worn stuffed rabbit with sleepy eyes and a smile that made the whole house feel brighter. Library day, she reminded him between bites of pancake. Nathan smiled. And chocolate milk afterward. I have not forgotten. Sophie grinned with complete confidence. She never worried about promises because her father had never given her a reason to. After dropping her at school, Nathan drove to the West Side Community Center, where his work reached far beyond repairing walls and broken furniture. Before picking up his toolbox, he helped a young father named Marcus practice interview questions for a construction job after months of unemployment. An hour later, he showed two teenagers how to build wooden bookshelves that would soon fill the children's reading room instead of teaching them how to simply follow instructions. Across the hallway, a grandmother watched her grandson finish his homework while volunteers prepared hot meals for families working late shifts. West Side was never just another building. It was where people came when life had nowhere else to send them. Nathan often said that fixing a broken door mattered because somebody's hope usually walked through it afterward. Just before noon, Mrs. Linda Alvarez entered the workshop carrying a large envelope. Her face told the story before her words did. The review is official, she said quietly. Nathan opened the letter without rushing. Whitmore Community Initiatives had begun a strategic restructuring. Funding would likely end within 60 days, and the property was now under consideration for commercial redevelopment. He read every page twice before folding it carefully. Mrs. Alvarez sighed. I have already called every contact I have. Nobody can arrange a meeting with the Whitmore Foundation. Nathan remained silent for several seconds, looking around the workshop where unfinished desks waited for neighborhood children returning after school. Finally, he spoke. Then we stopped waiting for someone to save us. Mrs. Alvarez looked up. Nathan continued calmly. We gather every family whose life has been changed here. We document every tutoring program, every veteran who found support, every parent who found work, every child who stayed safe because these doors stayed open. If someone is making this decision from an office downtown, then we bring the truth to their office. She studied him carefully before a small smile appeared. Danielle used to say almost the same thing. Nathan looked toward the old bulletin board where Danielle's handwriting still remained on a faded volunteer schedule from years earlier. He remembered one evening when she had returned home unusually quiet after work. She had spread neighborhood maps across their kitchen table, tracing several streets with her finger before folding them away the moment he walked into the room. When he asked what was wrong, she had simply answered, "Some projects look beautiful on paper until you meet the families living inside them." She never explained further, and a few weeks later life had become consumed by hospital visits and responsibilities that left the conversation unfinished. Nathan had often wondered what she had discovered, but he had never found the right moment to ask again. That afternoon, Sophie climbed into the pickup truck holding another colorful drawing. "Daddy, I made our family bigger." Nathan smiled as she unfolded the paper. He recognized himself, Sophie, and Danielle standing beneath a bright blue sky. Once again, another figure stood several feet away. "Still the same person?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded. "Maybe they are trying to find us." Nathan carefully placed the drawing beside every picture she had ever made. "Then I hope they know where to look." Across the city, Evelyn Whitmore sat alone inside a glass conference room overlooking Ashford. A stack of redevelopment reports rested in front of her. She flipped through page after page without interest until one address caught her attention. West Side Community Center. Her hand stopped moving. Attached to the report was a maintenance log signed by Nathan Brooks. She stared at his name much longer than she intended. A pen rested above the approval line waiting for her signature. Instead of signing, She slowly lowered the pen onto the table and looked back at Nathan's name once more, hearing his calm voice from the rainstorm echo through her memory. Everyone deserves one good meal after a day like this. For reasons she could not explain, she quietly closed the folder without making a decision. While somewhere deep inside the Whitmore files, another forgotten document connected to the same redevelopment project remained sealed, waiting for the day someone finally chose to uncover the truth. The following afternoon, a black sedan stopped quietly outside the West Side Community Center, drawing curious glances from children playing basketball near the entrance. Nathan was replacing a broken handrail beside the front steps when he noticed Evelyn stepping out without security, photographers, or assistants. She wore a simple navy coat instead of the designer suits she had worn during business events, but there was no hiding the quiet confidence that followed her everywhere. Sophie spotted her first and smiled. "Daddy, it is the lady from the storm." Nathan looked up, set his screwdriver aside, and walked toward the sidewalk. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "Looks like your car survived." Evelyn smiled before answering. "It did. Thank you again." For a brief moment, neither of them mentioned who she really was. The sounds of children laughing filled the space between them. Finally, Evelyn looked toward the old brick building. "I read the report this morning." Nathan nodded. "Then you know what happens if the funding disappears." She lowered her eyes. "That decision has not been finalized." Nathan glanced toward a group of children carrying backpacks into the center. For them, uncertainty feels a lot like losing. His words carried no accusation, only quiet truth. Evelyn watched a volunteer help an elderly veteran through the front doors before speaking again. "Would you have a few minutes to talk?" Nathan invited her into the small woodworking room, where shelves filled with donated books lined one wall beside half-finished tables built by neighborhood teenagers. Nothing inside looked expensive, yet everything reflected years of patient care. Evelyn slowly walked around the room, touching the smooth edge of a handcrafted bookshelf. "You built these?" she asked. "Most of them," Nathan answered. "The teenagers helped with the sanding." She smiled faintly. "They are better than the furniture in my office." Nathan laughed softly. "That probably says more about your office than these shelves." For the first time in days, Evelyn laughed too. The sound surprised even her. She had forgotten what laughter felt like when nobody expected anything in return. Her smile faded as she reached into her bag and placed a thick envelope on the workbench. "I should tell you the truth." Nathan remained silent. "My full name is Evelyn Whitmore." Nathan's expression did not change. "I figured that out after I saw your picture in yesterday's newspaper." She blinked. "You already knew?" "Since this morning." "Why did you not say anything?" Nathan shrugged gently. "Because yesterday you were still the same person whose car broke down in the rain." Evelyn looked at him for several long seconds, unsure how to respond to someone who refused to be impressed by wealth. She finally took a slow breath. "My father has given me 30 days to choose a husband before the board votes on the company's succession plan." Nathan raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. "He expects me to marry Grant Holloway. Do you want to?" Nathan asked. She answered immediately. "No." He nodded once. "Then do not." Evelyn almost smiled again. "It is not that simple." Nathan leaned against the workbench. "The important things rarely are." She hesitated before revealing the rest. "If I refuse, there is a strong chance the board will remove me from consideration as the next chief executive officer. Grant knows that. My father knows that. Everyone assumes I will eventually give in." Nathan folded his arms. "And where do I fit into all this?" Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. "I want you to pretend to be the man I chose." Silence settled over the workshop. Outside, children continued playing basketball, completely unaware that one conversation inside the building might alter every future they imagined. Nathan stared at Evelyn without anger or surprise. He simply weighed every word she had spoken. "You barely know me," he said quietly. "I know enough to trust your character." Nathan slowly shook his head. "Character is not something you borrow when life becomes inconvenient." Evelyn stepped closer. "I am not asking you to lie forever. Only long enough to stop my father from controlling the rest of my life." Nathan looked toward the family photograph resting on a shelf above his workbench. Danielle smiled back from another time while little Sophie sat on her shoulders. He remained silent until he heard small footsteps approaching the doorway. Sophie stood there holding her coloring book. She looked from Nathan to Evelyn with innocent curiosity. "Miss Evelyn," she asked softly. Do you need somebody to help you? Or do you need somebody to make your daddy mad? The question hung in the room with surprising weight. Evelyn felt her eyes sting because no executive, no lawyer, and no board member had ever asked the question she should have asked herself first. Nathan gently placed one hand on Sophie's shoulder before looking back at Evelyn. I will always help someone who truly needs it, he said calmly. But I will never let my daughter become part of a story that forgets the difference between using people and loving them. That evening, Nathan sat alone on the small wooden porch after Sophie had fallen asleep, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood while turning Evelyn's unexpected proposal over in his mind. Danielle used to remind him that the hardest decisions should never be made while emotions were louder than wisdom. So he waited until morning, allowing the quiet routine of another day to clear his thoughts. When Evelyn returned to Westside Community Center the following afternoon, she expected another conversation. Instead, she found Nathan kneeling beside a little boy's wheelchair near the front entrance. One of the wheels had locked, making it impossible for the child's exhausted mother to push him across the uneven sidewalk. Nathan smiled at the boy as he opened his toolbox. Give me 5 minutes, buddy. The little boy nodded with complete trust. Nathan carefully adjusted the damaged axle, replaced a worn bolt from his own supply box, and tested the wheel until it rolled smoothly again. Try it now. The mother pushed the wheelchair forward with surprised relief. How much do I owe you? Nathan simply closed his toolbox. Just promise me that when someone else needs help someday, you will remember this moment. Tears filled the woman's eyes as she thanked him before leading her son toward the playground. Evelyn watched the entire exchange without saying a word. There had been no cameras, no donors, no speeches, and no publicity. Nathan had solved a stranger's problem as naturally as breathing, then returned to sweeping sawdust from the workshop floor as though nothing extraordinary had happened. For the first time, she understood why everyone inside Westside looked at him with such quiet respect. It had nothing to do with money or authority. It was because people felt safe whenever he was nearby. Nathan finally looked up and noticed her standing in the doorway. You came back. Evelyn smiled softly. I needed to. After the last volunteer left, they stepped inside the woodworking room where unfinished bookshelves waited along one wall. Have you made your decision? She asked. Nathan nodded. Yes. Hope quietly returned to her face. You will help me? Nathan folded his hands in front of him. Only because this community deserves every chance it can get. Not because of your family, not because of your money, and certainly not because I want anything for myself. Evelyn answered without hesitation. I understand. Nathan raised one finger. Then there are 3 conditions. She straightened immediately. I am listening. First, Sophie is never part of any publicity. No interviews, no magazine photographs, no charity campaigns, and no stories that use my daughter to improve anyone's image. Evelyn nodded. Agreed. Nathan lifted a second finger. Second, if Sophie asks questions, we tell her the truth. I will not ask her to believe something that is not real. Evelyn opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Years inside boardrooms had taught her that difficult situations often required carefully managed versions of the truth. She hesitated for only a moment before lowering her eyes. I cannot pretend that comes naturally to me, she admitted. Quietly, I have spent most of my life believing that information should be controlled until the right time. Nathan remained calm. Children know the difference between confusion and dishonesty much sooner than adults do. Evelyn thought about Sophie, about the complete trust she placed in her father every morning, and slowly nodded. Then I will learn a different way. Agreed. Nathan smiled gently before raising a third finger. If I ever believe this arrangement is hurting Sophie or teaching her that people are meant to be used instead of loved, I leave. No contracts. No negotiations. Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. You have my word. That matters more than any signature, Nathan replied. Before either of them could continue, Sophie skipped into the workshop carrying a paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Miss Evelyn, she said happily. Daddy bought extra cinnamon rolls because he thought maybe you would come today. Nathan looked slightly embarrassed. It was only a guess. Sophie giggled. Daddy guesses right a lot. Evelyn accepted the warm pastry with both hands, smiling in a way that felt completely effortless. While the 3 of them shared the cinnamon rolls, Sophie suddenly looked at Evelyn with genuine curiosity. Miss Evelyn, do you know how to play Foursquare? Evelyn blinked. I do not think I have ever played. Sophie looked honestly surprised. Really? What did you play when you were little? The question caught Evelyn completely off guard. She searched her memory before quietly answering. Mostly piano lessons, etiquette classes, and business dinners with my father. Sophie frowned as though trying to understand a childhood without scraped knees or chalk squares drawn on the sidewalk. That sounds like a lot of work. Nathan watched Evelyn's expression soften. She realized she could remember learning how to shake hands with investors before she ever learned how to play a simple game with other children. For a moment, she quietly mourned the childhood she had never realized she had missed. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Mrs. Linda Alvarez stepped inside, holding another envelope marked with the Whitmore Foundation seal. Nathan, she said softly. The redevelopment board moved the hearing forward. They want a final recommendation within 1 week. Nathan accepted the letter without opening it. After Mrs. Alvarez left, he stood quietly staring at the envelope for several long moments. His thumb rested against the folded edge as though he already understood the weight it carried. Finally, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket with the same steady calm he brought to every difficult day. Evelyn watched him in silence. She suddenly realized that this ordinary man was preparing to walk into a meeting with one of the most powerful businessmen in America, not because he hoped to change his own life, but because he refused to abandon an entire community. Nathan looked toward the windows where children were still laughing outside before speaking in the same calm voice he always used. Then I suppose it is time your father meets the people he has only ever seen on paper. Evelyn followed his gaze toward the playground, and for the first time she wondered which man would truly leave that meeting changed. 2 evenings later, Evelyn arrived at Nathan's house carrying nothing more than a canvas grocery bag filled with fresh apples, oranges, and a small bouquet of wildflowers. She had suggested meeting at an elegant restaurant where they could quietly discuss how to face Richard Whitmore together, but Nathan had politely declined. If we are going to convince people we know each other, he had told her over the phone, we should probably begin by actually knowing each other. The little brick house glowed warmly beneath the porch light, and the smell of tomato soup and freshly baked bread drifted through the screen door before she even knocked. Sophie answered wearing an oversized apron dusted with flour. Miss Evelyn, she said happily. Daddy let me stir the soup today. Nathan looked over from the stove with an easy smile. She also reminded me every 2 minutes not to burn the bread. The three of them shared a simple dinner around a worn wooden table where every chair carried years of ordinary family memories. They talked about Sophie's art class, a stray cat that kept, visiting the neighborhood, and the children at West Side who were building birdhouses in the woodworking shop. Nobody mentioned board meetings or billion-dollar companies. Evelyn realized she had not enjoyed a meal this much in years. After dinner, she insisted on helping Nathan wash the dishes. He accepted without making a fuss. As she rolled up her sleeves, the cuff of her sweater slipped back slightly. Nathan's eyes paused for only a fraction of a second. Beneath the kitchen light, the small silver necklace rested quietly against her collarbone. The tiny music box charm shaped like a bird looked exactly like the one Danielle had worn almost every day of their marriage. His hands stopped moving beneath the warm running water, but only for a heartbeat. He carefully lowered another plate into the sink and forced himself to continue as though nothing had happened. Evelyn noticed the brief silence, but said nothing. Sophie wandered into the kitchen carrying a stack of crayons. Miss Evelyn, come see my drawing. They moved into the living room together where Sophie proudly explained every colorful detail of a picture showing Maple Street covered with flowers instead of cars. Nathan smiled while listening, though his thoughts kept returning to the necklace. Danielle had treasured that tiny music box because it had belonged to her mother. There should have been only one in the world. Hours seemed to pass before the house finally grew quiet again. Sophie settled onto the couch beside her coloring book while soft music played from an old radio in the corner. Evelyn sat with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, gathering the courage she had been searching for all evening. At last, she looked toward Nathan. You recognized the necklace the night of my father's birthday. Nathan met her eyes and nodded once. I did. Evelyn slowly lifted the small pendant into her hand. I owe you an explanation. Her voice became softer with every sentence. 12 years ago, I was driving home through the mountains after a charity fundraiser when a blizzard closed the highway. My car slid into a ditch, and one of the doors jammed shut. I was terrified. She paused before continuing. Another car stopped. A woman climbed through waist-deep snow without knowing who I was. She stayed beside me until rescue crews arrived. She kept talking the entire time because she said fear grows louder when people feel alone. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Those words sounded exactly like Danielle. Evelyn smiled sadly. Afterward, she refused every attempt to thank her. We stayed in touch for a while because she had started working with Whitmore Community Initiatives. On her last day, she placed this necklace in my hand. I argued with her because it was obviously precious. She only smiled and told me that heirlooms should sometimes travel farther than families do. Nathan said nothing. The room seemed to disappear around him as memories quietly returned one by one. Danielle laughing while winding the tiny music box before bedtime. Danielle fastening the necklace around her neck every Sunday morning. Danielle dancing barefoot in the kitchen while Sophie clapped her tiny hands. He stared toward the window for what felt like forever, allowing the silence to carry every memory he could not put into words. Evelyn did not interrupt. When Nathan finally looked back at her, she reached into her bag and carefully removed a thick sealed envelope. A few months after we lost contact, Danielle mailed this to me, she whispered. She asked me to keep it safe until the day I understood why it mattered. I never opened it. Nathan studied the unbroken seal, but made no move to take it. He recognized Danielle's handwriting immediately. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair before relaxing again. It has stayed sealed all these years, he asked quietly. Evelyn nodded. Exactly as she left it. Nathan lowered his eyes. A difficult thought slowly settled into his heart. Ever since Evelyn had walked into West Side, he had admired her courage, respected her honesty, and begun believing that perhaps fate had unexpectedly crossed their paths. But now another possibility quietly appeared. Was she standing in his home because she genuinely respected the man he had become, or because guilt over Danielle had finally brought her there? He did not accuse her. He did not ask the question aloud. Instead, he withdrew into thoughtful silence, protecting both his dignity and hers while searching for an answer that neither of them yet possessed. Sophie eventually fell asleep on the couch with a crayon still resting in her hand. Nathan crossed the room, gently lifted his daughter into his arms, and carried her upstairs exactly as he had done countless nights before. Evelyn remained alone in the quiet living room, holding Danielle's unopened envelope while listening to Nathan's footsteps slowly disappear above her. She looked down at the untouched seal once more and realized that whatever truth waited inside had remained patient for years, but once it was finally revealed, nothing between her and Nathan Brooks might ever be the same again. By the end of the week, the story had already escaped the walls of the Whitmore estate. A single photograph taken during the birthday gala appeared on business blogs before spreading across local news outlets. It showed Evelyn standing beside Nathan while Sophie held her father's hand, completely unaware that strangers across the country were debating a life she had never asked to place on display. Some headlines praised Evelyn for rejecting tradition. Others insisted Nathan had manipulated his way into one of the wealthiest families in America. Nathan ignored every article. He still packed Sophie's lunch before sunrise, still drove her to school, and still spent the afternoon repairing a broken wheelchair ramp outside the community center. He refused to let headlines decide the rhythm of his daughter's childhood. But other people were paying closer attention. Grant Holloway sat in his downtown office, staring at the same photograph with growing frustration. He had spent years preparing to marry Evelyn because the marriage represented far more than affection. It represented influence, board votes, investment partnerships, and the future he believed he deserved. Losing to another executive would have been disappointing. Losing to a quiet single father from Maple Street felt unbearable. He instructed a private investigator to learn everything possible about Nathan Brooks. 48 hours later, a thick folder landed on his desk. There were no hidden bank accounts, no criminal record, no unpaid taxes, and no secret scandals. Nathan's life was painfully ordinary. The only unusual discovery was that Danielle Brooks had once worked inside Whitmore Community Initiatives before her death. Grant leaned back in his chair as another thought slowly formed. He did not need to prove Nathan had done something wrong. He only needed people to believe it. The following morning, anonymous copies of an unfinished draft agreement appeared in several newsrooms. It was an early document Evelyn had prepared before meeting Nathan, outlining a temporary public engagement to delay the succession vote. The draft had never been signed and had been abandoned after Nathan insisted on honesty and clear boundaries. But none of that appeared in the leaked pages. Reporters immediately described the document as evidence that Nathan had accepted payment to pose as Evelyn's future husband. Television commentators filled entire segments with speculation. Social media reached its own conclusions within hours. By lunchtime, several reporters had gathered outside West Side Community Center. Nathan arrived carrying a box of donated school supplies only to find cameras waiting near the entrance. One reporter called out, "Mr. Brooks, did you enter this relationship for financial gain?" Another asked whether he planned to receive a settlement from the Whitmore family. Nathan paused only long enough to answer calmly, "Children are walking into this building. Please leave them out of your story." He carried the supplies inside without another word. The reporters received no dramatic confrontation, only a closed door. Unfortunately, the attention followed Sophie as well. That afternoon, two parents quietly pulled their children away from the playground after recognizing her from the photographs. One little boy asked an innocent question he had heard adults repeating. "Is your daddy trying to become rich?" Sophie looked confused more than hurt. "My daddy fixes things," she answered. "That is what he does." The boy shrugged and ran away, leaving the words hanging in the cool afternoon air. When Nathan picked her up after school, she remained unusually quiet during the drive home. She stared out the passenger window until they reached Maple Street. As they carried groceries inside, she finally asked the question she had been holding all day. "Daddy, did Miss Evelyn choose us because she wanted a family? Or because she needed help with her dad?" Nathan stopped placing food into the refrigerator. He had promised never to lie to his daughter, even when the truth hurt. He knelt until they were eye level. At first, she needed help, he admitted gently. But people can begin a journey for one reason and stay for another. Sometimes hearts change while we are walking. Sophie considered that carefully. "Do you think hers changed?" Nathan smiled sadly. "I hope so. But hope is different from knowing." That evening, Evelyn arrived carrying the sealed envelope Danielle had mailed years earlier. Before she could knock, Nathan stepped onto the porch. His expression remained kind, but there was a distance in his eyes she had never seen before. He had already heard about the leaked agreement. He had already watched his daughter struggle with questions no 8-year-old should have to answer. Evelyn began to apologize, but Nathan quietly raised one hand. "I believe you did not leak those papers," he said. "That is not the problem." She swallowed hard. "Then what is?" Nathan looked back through the screen door where Sophie sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework. "My daughter spent today wondering whether our family was only pretending. I can survive strangers questioning my character. I cannot ask her to carry doubts that belong to adults." Evelyn's voice almost disappeared. "Please do not walk away." Nathan lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting hers again. "If protecting Sophie costs me every opportunity standing in front of me, then the price is already worth paying. I promised her long ago that no dream, no title, and no wealthy family would ever become more important than the trust between us. That is one promise I will never break." Monday morning arrived beneath a gray autumn sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging over Whitmore headquarters. Reporters lined the sidewalks outside the glass tower while board members entered through the private entrance, speaking in unusually quiet voices. Inside the executive conference room, the succession vote had already been placed on the agenda, but no one seemed eager to begin. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table with the familiar confidence of a man who had led thousands of meetings, yet today his expression carried a fatigue that could not be hidden. Evelyn entered carrying Danielle's unopened envelope. Caleb Monroe stood as soon as he saw it. "Have you opened it?" he asked softly. Evelyn shook her head. "I promised myself I would only open it when I was finally ready to hear Danielle, instead of defending everything I already believed." Caleb nodded once. "Then let her speak." With careful hands, Evelyn broke the aging seal. Inside rested financial reports, handwritten notes, neighborhood maps, a small flash drive taped beneath the final folder, and a handwritten letter. Danielle's familiar handwriting immediately filled the room with a silence no one interrupted. She described unusual transfers involving affordable housing projects, repeated requests for internal audits that had quietly disappeared, and her growing fear that redevelopment plans meant to help working families were instead removing them from the very neighborhoods they had built. She never accused Richard Whitmore directly. Instead, she wrote that someone inside the executive structure had learned how to hide behind layers of routine approvals. Her final sentence stopped Evelyn's breathing for a moment. If these records ever become necessary, please remember that truth should protect innocent families, not satisfy revenge. Caleb immediately connected the flash drive to a secure company computer. Hundreds of archived emails, accounting records, property transfers, approval logs, and compliance reports appeared one file at a time. Instead of rushing to conclusions, Caleb carefully compared each document against the company's official database. Every few minutes, he quietly asked an assistant to retrieve another archived file or verify another digital signature. Several board members leaned forward as inconsistencies slowly emerged. Grant Holloway remained remarkably composed. Archived files prove very little, he said evenly. Every large corporation reorganizes documents. Old drafts, duplicate approvals, and abandoned proposals often look suspicious when viewed without context. Several directors nodded. His explanation sounded reasonable. Caleb did not argue. Instead, he calmly opened a second group of emails. These messages were sent 3 days before the redevelopment committee officially approved the project, he explained. Notice the timestamps. One director frowned. The committee meeting had not happened yet. Caleb nodded. Exactly, Grant answered immediately. Preliminary discussions are completely normal. Again, the explanation seemed plausible. Caleb quietly opened another file. This time, it contained payment schedules linked to shell companies that had purchased several redevelopment properties only days after confidential committee discussions. Another director compared the transaction dates with Danielle's handwritten notes. The timelines matched almost perfectly. Grant folded his hands together. Real estate partnerships frequently involve intermediary corporations. That is standard business practice. Caleb acknowledged the point. It can be. He then projected another email onto the screen. It showed Grant personally instructing compliance staff to postpone Danielle Brooks' audit request until after final redevelopment approval because, in his own words, unnecessary questions could delay investor confidence. No one spoke. Caleb opened one final spreadsheet. Every redirected payment flowed through the same network of companies before returning to investment groups connected to Grant's private partnerships. The room became completely still. One by one, skeptical board members began comparing approval dates, electronic signatures, bank transfers, and internal correspondence. The pattern was no longer based on one suspicious document. It existed across dozens of independent records that confirmed one another from different departments over several years. Grant's confidence slowly faded. Everything I approved was technically legal, he insisted. Every transaction followed existing regulations. Caleb answered calmly. Legality was never Danielle's concern. Transparency was. Richard removed his glasses and looked across the table toward Grant with quiet disappointment. Did you intentionally hide these reports from executive review? Grant hesitated for the first time. His silence answered before his words ever could. Richard slowly closed the folder in front of him. Then my greatest mistake was believing that a well-designed system no longer required people willing to question it. Evelyn stood. Her voice remained steady despite the emotion filling the room. I am withdrawing from today's succession vote until an independent investigation reviews every redevelopment project connected to these documents. If I ever lead this company, it will only happen after every affected family receives a fair review, every compliance process becomes independent, and Westside Community Center remains permanently protected. No one applauded. Instead, several directors quietly nodded before voicing their agreement one after another. Caleb then looked toward the conference room doors. There is one more person I asked to come today. Nathan Brooks entered wearing the same simple work clothes he had worn while repairing the community center that morning. He carried no prepared speech and made no effort to impress anyone. Caleb invited him forward only because Danielle's work and Westside had become inseparable from the truth now unfolding. Richard looked at Nathan with genuine respect. Mr. Brooks, Caleb said gently, if there is anything you believe this board should hear, now is the time. Nathan remained silent for several seconds before speaking in the calm voice everyone at Westside already knew. Danielle never wanted revenge, he said quietly. She believed every company, every neighborhood, and every family eventually becomes exactly what it chooses to protect. She gathered those records because children should never lose their homes, so someone else's numbers look better on a quarterly report. If you honor her today, do not do it for our family. Do it for every ordinary family that trusted this company to keep its promises. Nothing more needed to be said. Richard slowly stood before the entire board. For too many years, he admitted, I trusted the strength of our systems more than the courage of honest people willing to challenge them. That failure belongs to me. Today we begin correcting it. The meeting ended without celebration. Outside, reporters waited for dramatic headlines while inside. Real change had quietly begun. Late that afternoon, Nathan was repairing a weathered park bench outside Westside Community Center when an older sedan pulled into the parking lot. There were no chauffeurs, no security vehicles, and no assistants opening the door. Richard Whitmore stepped out alone after driving himself, closed the car door with his own hand, and stood silently for a moment looking at the children playing nearby. For the first time in decades, the billionaire had arrived somewhere without the distance created by power, carrying nothing except the humility to begin asking forgiveness. 1 year later, the first thing visitors noticed about the West Side Community Center was not the renovated playground, the fresh brickwork, or the new classrooms. It was the sign hanging beside the entrance. Beneath the original name was a simple line engraved in bronze, dedicated to every parent who teaches a child that dignity is worth more than pride and kindness is stronger than power. Nathan paused in front of the sign every morning before unlocking the front doors. The building was busier than it had ever been. The after-school programs had doubled. The vocational workshop he had dreamed about for years now trained single parents in carpentry, electrical maintenance, plumbing, and home repair, helping dozens of families find stable jobs without leaving their neighborhoods behind. None of the classrooms carried his name because he had quietly refused every suggestion to rename the center after himself. The building belongs to the community, he always said, not to one person. Sophie had grown taller over the past year, and her backpack seemed smaller every week. She still insisted on helping Nathan open the center before school whenever she could. One crisp Saturday morning, she raced across the playground laughing with children whose families had once feared they would lose this place forever. Inside the administrative office, Evelyn reviewed grant applications with a small team of educators and neighborhood leaders. After withdrawing from the succession vote, she had kept her promise. The Whitmore Foundation no longer decided community funding behind closed doors. Every major project was now reviewed by an independent public board that included teachers, veterans, social workers, and local residents. Some investors had criticized her decision. Others had admired it. Evelyn no longer measured success by either opinion. She measured it by the number of children still filling classrooms every afternoon. Richard Whitmore visited quietly once a week. He arrived without television cameras or public announcements, carrying books for the reading program or tools for the workshop. He never tried to erase the mistakes of the past with grand speeches. Instead, he learned to stack chairs after community dinners, repaint fences beside volunteers, and sit patiently while neighborhood children taught him card games he had never played before. Respect, he discovered, could not be purchased. It could only be earned one ordinary day at a time. One afternoon, he found Nathan repairing an old park bench outside the center. You know, Richard said with a gentle smile, I spent decades believing leadership meant standing in front of people. Lately, I have learned it often means standing beside them. Nathan tightened one final bolt before looking up. Most lessons take exactly as long as we are willing to listen. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for giving me another chance to become the kind of grandfather Sophie deserves. Nathan looked toward the playground where Sophie was teaching 2 younger children how to plant flowers along the walkway. She believes people can change, he replied quietly. I decided I wanted to deserve that belief too. Later that evening, the annual community celebration filled the renovated courtyard with music, homemade food, and families from every part of the city. There were no reserved tables and no special seating. Teachers ate beside construction workers. Business owners shared desserts with retired veterans. Children ran from one activity to another without noticing who was wealthy and who was not. As the sun slowly settled beyond the rooftops, Sophie climbed onto the small wooden stage carrying the same drawing she had made nearly a year earlier. The paper was worn from being folded so many times. She smiled at Nathan before turning toward Evelyn. Do you remember this? She asked. Evelyn looked carefully at the picture. She recognized Nathan, Sophie, and Danielle standing beneath the blue sky. Then she noticed the fourth person still standing a short distance away. Sophie grinned. "Last year Daddy asked me who that person was." Evelyn smiled softly. "You said you did not know yet." Sophie nodded. "I know now." She reached into her backpack, removed a box of colored pencils, and carefully colored the fourth figure until she wore the same blue sweater Evelyn had on that evening. Then Sophie folded the drawing and placed it into Evelyn's hands. "Now everybody is home." Evelyn's eyes filled with quiet tears. She knelt beside Sophie. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I will spend every day trying to deserve this picture." Nathan watched them from a few feet away. He remembered the night Evelyn had first asked him to pretend. Neither of them could have imagined that the greatest change would not happen inside a boardroom or beneath crystal chandeliers. It would happen in moments like this, where trust slowly replaced fear and ordinary kindness quietly became love. Several months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, family and friends gathered beneath the large oak tree beside the community center. There were no luxury ballrooms, no celebrity guests, and no headlines waiting outside. Nathan and Evelyn exchanged simple vows surrounded by the people whose lives had brought them together. Margaret smiled proudly from the front row. Mrs. Linda Alvarez wiped away happy tears. Richard stood quietly with folded hands, grateful simply to be included. After the ceremony, Sophie walked between Nathan and Evelyn, holding one hand of each. She looked up at Evelyn with the same serious expression she always wore before asking an important question. "Are you staying after today?" Evelyn smiled, squeezed her hand gently, and answered without hesitation. "I am staying after every ordinary Monday, every difficult Thursday, every school recital, every flat tire, every birthday, every disappointment, every celebration, and every tomorrow that follows." Families are not built by one promise. They are built by keeping thousands of small ones. Sophie wrapped her arms around Evelyn, then reached for Nathan's hand again. The three of them walked slowly across the playground as children laughed nearby and evening light settled over the neighborhood. Nathan glanced once toward the old bronze sign before looking at the two people beside him. Danielle had once told him that the strongest homes were never the biggest ones. They were simply the places where people chose each other again and again. As the gate closed behind them and the sounds of the community faded into the peaceful rhythm of another ordinary evening, Nathan realized that the greatest blessing life had given him was never wealth, recognition, or victory over anyone else. It was the quiet privilege of raising his daughter in a family built not on power, but on truth, compassion, forgiveness, and love that finally found its way home.